It's hard to know if it's driven by the nature of the story itself, or if it's just an unfortunate byproduct of the way that fandom tends to work. But the Song of Ice and Fire fandom often pits Elia Martell and Lyanna Stark against each other as some kind of rivals for Rhaegar Targaryen's love or attention. But with the introduction of young Griff, who at the very least believes that he is the son of Elia Martell, but who very well may be the real deal, the long-term effects of what happened to the mothers of Rhaegar Targaryen's children seems poised to play a pretty significant role in the story going forward. One of the prevailing assumptions about Elia and Lyanna is that Lyanna was somehow the chosen one, that she was truly so special, and Rhaegar was so genuinely in love with her, that even his marriage to Elia and their 2 children couldn't stop the fated union of House Targaryen and House Stark. And some particularly bizarre takes regarding the whole Elia, Rhaegar, Lyanna triangle seem to think that Elia may have actually been supportive of Rhaegar and Lyanna's relationship, because it was a necessity to bring 3 heads of the dragon back into the world. But what's interesting about these undeniably odd takes is that Rhaegar Targaryen moved through his own life, presuming that he was the main character of the entire story. And fans seem to interpret Elia and Lyanna through that lens as well. They're important to the overall narrative, to be sure, but they're just supporting players in Rhaegar's story and the story of House Targaryen. However, based on the actual content of the narrative, it seems like this couldn't be further from the truth. The notion that Elia and/or Lyanna understood Rhaegar's point of view and were supportive participants in his quest to create 3 heads of a Targaryen dragon is honestly extremely bizarre. Yes, the contemporary storyline of A Song of Ice and Fire is experiencing a rebirth of magic. But in Elia and Lyanna's era, it appears that mystical power has all but died out. As readers can see throughout A Game of Thrones, Ned is quite skeptical of the unnatural signs that he sees before him. So it seems safe to assume that Lyanna similarly didn't believe in anything much beyond her experienced reality. And although we know less about Elia, it also seems unlikely that she believes in magic, given its near extinction in her time. But frankly, regardless of whether or not they perhaps believed in anything supernatural, Rhaegar's belief that he or his children were the literal messiahs of the world was absolutely batshit crazy. And given that he came from a family that was notorious for going off the deep end, there's almost no chance that either of them, or any remotely rational person, would be willing to sacrifice everything based on Rhaegar's outlandish beliefs. Lyanna's history with Rhaegar isn't as illustrated as Elia's quite yet, but I sincerely believe that both of these women wound up becoming victims of his astounding delusions of grandeur, and that neither of them were remotely interested in being the broodmares for Rhaegar's super special snowflakes. Because honestly, who would be? A huge aspect of the fandom perception of Rhaegar's beliefs are actually driven by Jon. Because Jon is so clearly telegraphed as a special and unique character, that automatically lends itself to understanding and believing in Rhaegar's assumption that his child is destined to save the world. But this actually looks like a pretty classic POV trap. The fact that Jon is extraordinary doesn't mean that Rhaegar's interpretation of prophecy is right. And even if he winds up being correct that Jon is some fabled savior, which seems unlikely anyway, his presumption that Jon is exceptional because he is Rhaegar's son, a Targaryen, or a head of the dragon, seems to be demonstrably false. Because, throughout the entire story so far, everything that has apparently made Jon special and extraordinary is his Stark side, not his Targaryen side. And although Aegon has only recently been introduced to A Song of Ice and Fire, this interestingly seems to be true for him as well. Yes, he's certainly using his Targaryen heritage as a means of acquiring power and support for his claim to the Iron Throne. But much like Jon, everything in his actual experience and story seems to be all about his mother. It's curious that so few fans question Rhaegar's narrative, given how heavy-handed George R.R. Martin is when it comes to telegraphing what really matters in this circumstance. Interestingly, Dany has picked up a similar fixation on the idea of finding her other two heads of the dragon. But George has clearly gone very far out of his way to make Jon and young Griff their mother's sons. Jon might be named Snow, but it's repeated many times throughout the narrative that he is more Stark-like than any of Ned Stark's true-born sons. And Arya is the only other Stark child of his generation that comes close to being as Starkish as he is. He's a Northman through and through. He's a warg with a direwolf. He's the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. And he makes allusions to his distaste of any and all things Southern multiple times during the story. While young Griff obviously can't quite say the same, as he both has the classic Targaryen looks and is at least aware of, and directly claims, his Targaryen heritage. It's fascinating that George R.R. Martin has so intentionally made his journey thus far focus on the Rhoynar culture, and has implied that his life experience, prior to his introduction into the story, is much closer to the Rhoynar experience than the Valyrian one. As Lord Varys explains to Kevin Lannister, he has lived with fisherfolk, worked with his hands, swum in rivers and mended nets, and learned to wash his own clothes at need. He can fish and cook and bind up a wound. He knows what it is like to be hungry, to be hunted, and to be afraid. He has lived as someone who has to survive on the water. He knows what it's like to be afraid and hunted, much like Nymeria and the Rhoynar who fled the Valyrian conquest. And he is literally sailing down the Rhoyne in a rundown poleboat when he's introduced to the story at large. Clearly, his life experience seems to be entirely Rhoynish and not at all Valyrian. But even on an individualistic level, it's fascinating how much Elia and Lyanna seem to parallel each other personally, completely outside of Rhaegar and House Targaryen's influence. Because yes, they were both mothers to Rhaegar's children, but the actual effect that they had on the world was far greater than just being child providers. Although Elia doesn't get her due for the vast majority of the story, it's incredible how much Lyanna and Elia mirror each other when it comes to the impact that they have on their families. Obviously, Robert's rebellion was a cataclysmic event for all of Westeros. But it's interesting and incredibly moving to see how much Elia and Lyanna really meant to the Martells and the Starks. The Seven Kingdoms obviously doesn't place a lot of value on women at large. So the fact that both of them had such an irrevocable impact on their families is both heartbreaking and heartwarming. Because Elia and Lyanna weren't just valued by their families. They were intensely and deeply loved. In a world that is generally Machiavellian and brutal, the Martell and the Stark families weren't completely changed because their deaths signified some slight to the respect or power of their houses, but simply because the loss of them was so painful that their surviving loved ones were utterly incapable of moving on from it. And although Jon and Aegon never actually met their mothers, it seems like the earth-shattering effect that their loss had on their families is going to have a guaranteed effect on the characters themselves. It's also very interesting, because although Rhaegar was far from the only Targaryen to believe this, it seems like he saw Elia and Lyanna as a means to his very specific end. And ironically, his attitude regarding the two of them being valuable, mostly in relation to him, will likely be the undoing of everything he thought that he was working towards. House Targaryen has some problematic ideals, to say the least. But one of their biggest issues is that both as a group and as individuals, they consider themselves to be more important than anything or anyone else. A pretty consistent theme from the beginning of their reign to their end is that they are destined for greatness, and the cost for that greatness could never be too big of a price to pay. No matter what the collateral damage becomes, up to and including literal wars that result in the death and destruction of countless innocent people, it's worth it because the Targaryens are just too important. They're literally gods among men. And it's clear that this was Rhaegar's rationale as well. Sure, he likely didn't intend for Robert's rebellion to happen. But even when it did, he was more concerned about fulfilling his own imagined destiny at any cost, rather than actually putting a stop to what was happening. And unfortunately, the apocalyptic importance of Jon and Aegon's existence was a huge factor in his willingness to sacrifice the irrelevant people to protect the relevant ones. But ironically, his narcissism and ego, a Targaryen ideal that was unfortunately passed down to Daenerys as well, is likely why the remaining 3 heads of the dragon will be rivals instead of allies, and why House Targaryen as a whole will finally collapse. George R.R. Martin has directly stated that the woman is important too, within the text of A Song of Ice and Fire. And he has reiterated that idea many times over with most of his characters. Whether it's Catelyn or Cersei, the importance of women within the narrative and the impact that they can have on their own children is massive. So, to assume that Jon and young Griff's status as Targaryens is what really matters about them is a massive mistake that the author has repeatedly cautioned the readers about making. Jon and Aegon might both be Rhaegar's sons, but their maternal family seems to be the much stronger influence on who they are as people. And although they will undoubtedly be very important players in the story, they almost certainly won't be playing the role that Rhaegar imagined for them when he willingly put Elia and Lyanna in danger in order to bring them into the world. But what do you think? Will Elia and Lyanna become the linchpins that drive a wedge between House Targaryen and its current trio of dragons? Leave your thoughts and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.